covers Greene County, Washington County, and Fayette County. Okay, but again, it's a collaboration between both the museum and through our chapter. Okay, we bring different speakers here, and many of you are probably familiar with that over the years. And Janice keeps us all informed as to what's going on. Fortunately, so we know. Okay. Tonight's guest speaker is Dr. Olivia Jones. She's the lead curator at the Grave Creek Mound Archaeological Complex in Moundsville, West Virginia. What you see in the background is the Grave Creek Mound. It's surprising how many people don't really know about that. Okay, and so she'll be talking about that. And so her title, of course, is the Grave Creek Mound Archaeological Complex. Okay, and she's also an adjunct faculty member at WVU, where she teaches classes in bioarchaeology. Not forensics. No, but bioarchaeology, because her background is in osteology. She did her dissertation research on sites over in Europe. Right? Yep. And she's back here in the States working. Okay, so I will turn the floor over to her.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks everyone for coming. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll try to articulate well. So like John said, we are Grave Creek Mound Archaeological Complex. We're located in Moundsville, which is about 20 minutes south of Wheeling. So it took me less than an hour to get here, although I do drive really fast. So maybe an hour if you're traveling there. So I'll go through a little bit about the history of the site, so the history of the mound itself. I'll talk a little bit about the background of the mound and the exhibits. So I'll just talk a little bit about the exhibits, but I'll talk mostly about the research facility, which is where I'm the lead curator, and some of the current projects that we're working on. So just raise your hand if you have any questions or if you can't hear me. So it's very informal. So what you see here is an aerial photograph of the site. So as you can see, you see the mound, which is the big kind of brown circle there. You can see the research facility and the museum. And so the mound itself, we know we have one radiocarbon date, which is around 250 BC. So that's our one date that we have for the mound, which places it pretty squarely in the late early woodland, so late Adena period. But the rest of the site is much more recent. The site first had a museum in 1839, so actually in the mound, so I'll show that a little bit. We had a second museum, which is the little gray square, the little gray rectangle there, which was first built in 1937 and then added on to in 1952. And then our current museum, which is in that kind of lower left corner section there, which was built in 1978, and then the research facility, which was added on to in 2008. So a lot happening there. But you can see that the only area that really wasn't built on was the mound itself. There used to be an alley through there. There used to be a row of houses where the parking lot is. There used to be another row of houses back where our garden is, kind of on the back side. So the entire site was pretty much disturbed in the historic period. So the only thing that's really mostly intact is the mound itself. So the mound was kind of in private ownership for all of the 1700s and 1800s by the same family. It was the Tomlinson family, which is the name of the road actually on the one side of the mound. They first dug into it in 1838 and put a kind of small rudimentary, what we would kind of call, I guess, a museum in 1839. It actually went into the mound and had this huge chamber. There was a skeleton. It was very, very Victorian, I think. It was kind of scary looking. So they had this kind of central chamber, but it was pretty much closed a couple years later because no one really came. They thought it was going to be this big, huge tourist draw. They wanted to charge entrance to, have all these people come and see it. But really no one came. It wasn't that, exciting, to be honest. So kind of in the late 1800s, the kind of chamber kind of collapsed. There was at one point a saloon on top of it. During the Civil War, there was supposedly a cannon on top of it. It had a lot of different lives to it. At some point, the state of West Virginia actually acquired it in about 1909. And for a long time, until the kind of first little museum was built, it was pretty much under the guard or the watch of the penitentiary, which is our neighbor. So across from the mound was this West Virginia State Penitentiary that was opened, I believe, 1864, and then recently closed in 1996. So actually, if you come and visit the mound, you can also visit the penitentiary if you're interested in kind of incarceration history. Very interesting. But so it had a lot of kind of different lives to it at the beginning. The kind of interest that we kind of pick up, or we kind of start, say, the kind of beginning of professional archaeology in West Virginia really kind of begins with this guy, which was Delphin Rona. He was a local Moundsville business guy, and he used to walk by the mound all the time. He became really passionate about local history, and he was one of the founding members of the West Virginia Archaeological Society, along with a couple other amateur archaeologists and one professional archaeologist, Ralph Selecki from the Smithsonian. But at some point, he just became so interested, and he really became like the local expert on the mound, and he started becoming an activist for its preservation. So he was the one who really kind of got enough interest and got enough momentum to build that kind of small little museum on the site in 1938. He actually passed away in '74, and the museum built in 1978. That we're the museum now. We still kind of pay homage to him and call it the Delphin Rona Museum. But he was a very local guy who was just really interested in archaeology. So the museum was constructed in '78 by the governor of West Virginia then, who was Arch Moore. The exhibit design that we're kind of working on and kind of started, a lot of the exhibits were built in the '70s, and a couple years ago they were definitely outdated. So we started updating a lot of the exhibits starting in 2015. But kind of looking at the mound itself, before we kind of look at the museum exhibits, we're looking at the mound. So this is a view from the top of the mound looking towards the museum. And the mound was built by a group of people we call the Adena. It was a type site. The first one was excavated in Adena, Ohio. So it becomes kind of the type site, it becomes the name of the culture. Over a period of roughly 500 years, but again, the only radiocarbon date that we have for Grave Creek Mound is 250 BC. So that's the only solid date that we have, but we assumed it was kind of built over a period of time. There's estimates of 3 million baskets of soil, sand, and clay. The mounds were not built randomly. They weren't built without care or thought. They were built with, a sophisticated concept of engineering. These things are 2,000 years old, and they are pretty much the same size. So it was, very kind of calculated construction of using different kinds of soil, using different kinds of sand, and using clay to build the mounds. It's the second largest, although I guess we could argue it's almost the largest conical burial mound in the world. The other one is Miamisburg, Ohio, which is also roughly about 70 feet tall. So it's quite a hike if you actually want to climb to the top. Kind of get a little out of breath, but it is a stunning view. You can really see the hillside around it. If you look the other direction, you can see the entire Ohio River Valley. It would have been a really stunning landscape. It was first observed by colonists, 1770s, 1700s, again by Joseph Tomlinson during a deer hunt. This entire area was so wooded, they didn't actually recognize the mound when they first came there. When colonists first came and settled the area, they didn't actually recognize that there was a huge burial mound there because it was so heavily forested. Does anyone have any questions or anything? Okay, just want to make sure. So looking at the kind of excavation of the mound, again, the Tomlinson family owned it from the 1700s onward. It was excavated in 1838. The Tomlinson family was pretty good about protecting it for a long time, until the 1830s when Abelard Tomlinson, I think a nephew of the original owner, really kind of drummed up some support and began excavating it. When they excavated it, they did not level it. The mound is still, we would kind of assume, almost 90% intact. The only excavations that they did were they put in a shaft here at the ground surface, and they put in a burial shaft, or an excavation shaft right down through the middle. And what they found were two very Adena-looking tombs. They're log-lined tombs, so they're actually lined with huge timbers. And one here at the base of the mound, and then one about halfway up. Whether or not that corresponds to different burial phases, we're not sure, again, because the only radiocarbon date we have is one signal one. If we could, do radiocarbon dating for multiple levels, we might be able to establish the kind of construction history of the mound, but we're not able to do that. In these two log tombs, there were only 3 individuals. They were buried with very typical Adena burial goods, so copper bracelets, mica, a lot of shell beads, so a lot of kind of pretty objects that you would bury someone with. Very high status, very, very nice objects. Whether or not these people were, leaders in the society or religious leaders, we're not sure, but they were important enough to bury in a special way. So that is something that we can say. More recent excavations, we don't excavate the mound anymore. It is a protected site. It is protected federally. It's protected state. But we can do other investigations, I should say. In 2016, there was a PhD student. He was from, I think, Bradford in the UK. And he was doing a study on GPR, which is ground penetrating radar. It's a little box you drag across the ground, shoots out radar, and then it comes back. And what they're really measuring is how dense something is, if the radar goes through it very easily, or if it bounces back on something. They can identify whether or not there is kind of still an intact feature in the ground, maybe a burial chamber. Unfortunately, when they did it in 2016, what they found is that either it was too dry or too wet at the time, I can't remember, but they actually couldn't go very deep. The radar only went about 3 or 4 feet deep, so they couldn't actually see what was in the entire mound. They want to come back and actually do it again and see if they can get some different data. But these are the only kind of investigations we'll do, which is non-destructive, non-invasive. But no other excavations of the mound have ever taken place other than that 1838 excavation. So we treat it very much still as a cemetery site, as a burial site. We assume that there are still people buried in there. That's always a really common question we get from the public. But we always assume that there are still other people buried in there. Does anybody have any questions about the mound or the excavations so far? I'm just going to go on to exhibits then. So like I said, our museum was built in 1978. So as you can see, there's a lot of concrete. It was very popular architecture at the time. So we have a couple different kind of sections of the museum. This is one, we have a kind of fossil exhibits or the kind of prehistory of West Virginia. Most of these are on loan from a paleontologist in West Virginia. But the kids definitely, they always love the big stegodon. It's very impressive. The other exhibit that we have here is just kind of a selection of sites from around West Virginia, beginning chronologically with Archaic period, kind of moving into early, middle, and late woodland. Some of the kind of well-known sites are the St. Albans site in West Virginia, which set the chronology for most of the eastern woodlands, because it was a very deeply stratified site. The other section of the museum we have a really large dugout canoe that was gifted to us by the Seneca Nation. It's one piece of white pine that was hollowed out using a traditional burn and carve technique. And it's called the Hellbender. Does anyone know what a Hellbender is? It's a salamander. It's a salamander, yeah. So they named it after the West Virginia salamander, which is the Hellbender. So it's very nice. And actually, we're redoing the signage for this. So my museum assistant is designing some really very creative signage that I would never come up with. But it's a really nice piece in our museum, also because kids can sit in it. So old school groups sit in there and they line up, and it's very cute. They get all their picture taken when they come for school group tours. So it's very nice. The other section we have in the upper gallery of the museum features more exhibits about the mound itself, about the Adena culture itself. talking about foodways. The Adena culture was the first to cultivate and domesticate a lot of plants. Sunflowers are one of the things that they domesticated. And we also have kind of the first news report of the excavation. And we have some cases on the mound builder myth. So the mound builder myth is the myth that Native Americans did not build the mounds. They were built by this other race of people. It's a very problematic myth, and we still get a lot of people asking about it. So we specifically designed kind of cases to interact with the public about that. So those are very helpful as well. This really kind of fun diorama that shows the construction of the mound. The one exhibit that we just finished, well, about 90% finished, is we have a replica Adena structure. And this structure is almost life-size. It's a little bit smaller to kind of fit in the museum. But what it is underneath the mounds, before they were building the mounds, there were wooden structures actually placed in that area. And when archaeologists were excavating them, all they could see were these little black circles, post molds. And so they knew that there was a structure actually underneath the mound, or a structure that was built before the mound was built and then dismantled. So we know that some kind of structure was actually being either placed where the mound was going to be built, or that structure was being dismantled and the mounds were being placed on it. Usually it has a central hearth feature. Sometimes there is a burial on the floor of these structures. We're not actually sure if they were used for domestic purposes. They don't look like it. We expect kind of a house that someone's lived in. We also expect to see a lot of trash from that domestication, or that kind of domestic space. We expect to see middens. We expect to see, animal remains. We expect to see broken pottery. We don't really see those in these structures. So there's a possibility that these structures are being built for some kind of ritual purpose before the mound is being built, actually. Maybe to consecrate the land, or whatever kind of other reason, basically. So we wanted to kind of show what that structure would have looked like. And archaeologically, all we know what the footprint looks like. So the entire construction, of the structure itself was really informed with our tribal partners. They told us kind of what wood to use, what wood they would use in their longhouses, what stands up to weather. Most of the wood was sourced from West Virginia, except the birch. We had shipped in something actually, but everything else we got from West Virginia DNR, so it would be as local as possible. But that's kind of a fun exhibit that we're almost done with. We need to put a glass enclosure around it and the signage. We have a gift shop with mostly West Virginia glass, actually. but our gift shop person would have absolutely murdered me if I didn't put this in there. So the section that I'll talk a little bit more about, because it's more of my wheelhouse, is the West Virginia Archaeological Research and Collections Management Facility, which is just a very long name for both a lab and a storage area. So we are a research center for other archaeologists that they're doing research in West Virginia archaeology or regional archaeology. And we're also the repository, which means that we are the state repository for any archaeological collection in West Virginia. So we have collections from all over the state, all different time periods. So we have kind of a lab space, we have a library, and then we have our storage areas. And what the storage areas look like is this kind of very sterile looking white movable shelves. And we curate all of the archaeological collections, again, in the state. And what that looks like is we curate artifacts, we curate site files. So every archaeological site has a corresponding site file, a paper record. But we also, really importantly, curate all of the archives, all the excavation notes, the field notes, the maps, slides, which I feel like everyone in here knows what a slide is, but some of my like 18-year-old students don't know what a slide is. Yeah, good question.
Speaking of artifacts, going back to the mound, when they excavated this, did they find much?
Yes, so there were artifacts. We don't have any of them.
What happened to them?
They kept with the Tomlinson family for a while. They then changed hands. I think I've tracked down some to the British Museum, which is not really that surprising.
No, right.
And the Smithsonian. So a lot of them were bought and sold because it was 1838. There were
Right.
no archaeological laws at that time. You could buy and sell whatever you wanted, basically. So I think I've tracked down some of them, actually in the British Museum, so I'm hoping to go to London and actually photograph them. We will probably not get them back in my lifetime, but I at least want to photograph them so that we have a record of what they have.
And I have one more question. Is, was there any kind of, like you said, this is like the Wild West, there are no records, but was there like a rough idea on your part of how many artifacts might have been in a barrow like this?
We have some archival drawings of what was contained in there, but my guess is they only drew the really cool stuff.
Right.
You know, some of the projectile points,
Yeah.
some of the flakes may not have actually even been recorded, or they weren't even recognized. So I mean, you got to think of amateur archaeologists, or not even archaeologists to be honest, they had never seen this material before and they're digging it, so they don't even know what they're looking at. So they're probably missing ceramics, flakes, things like that. But we do know that there were bone beads, there were shell beads, there were copper bracelets, kind of the really typical, Adena standardized collection, basically. So nothing unexpected necessarily.
Okay.
But that's a good question because it's a real sore spot that we don't have any artifacts. Yeah.
Well, how did you date it back to the 250 BC?
That's a great question as well. There was a guy, our state archaeologist in 1977, who actually took pores, which means you take a big cylinder of soil out of the mound, and they found charcoal in there. So they radiocarbon dated the charcoal.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's where the 250 BC comes from.
Okay.
Yeah, good question though.
Thank
Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
Wasn't the mound part of a larger ceremonial site?
Absolutely. It was part of a huge complex. And the problem is that, the eyewitness accounts we have of that are, very much early 1800s, which are not terrible, but, the whole town of Moundsville basically built up on top of it. So we don't know where a lot of the earthworks were. Supposedly there was a causeway to the river. There's an early kind of account of that being happening and a kind of an enclosure around the mound. But there were hundreds of mounds, in that area, in that flat area.
The smaller ones down there in somebody's backyard.
There's one across from the high school over at the Cockane farmhouse. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's just a little guy.
Right,
It's about this tall. Yeah.
Has it been investigated?
I think someone just put a little edge on it just to confirm that it is, a cultural mound and not, someone's like trash heap basically. But yeah, I think they did confirm that it was a mound. Yeah. And that's a good question though too. But when we see Moundsville today, it looks like the mound is just, by itself. Like there's nothing around it. But that's because the whole, town just destroyed basically everything else. There were other, hundreds of little mounds in the flat area, but also on the hilltops basically. So we have, accounts of where some of those are, but not great locations. So it would have been very much, a built landscape. It wasn't just, one mound in the middle of this empty field. It would have been absolutely like a complex, like we see at Marietta, like we see at Chillicothe. I mean, because 7 feet tall is one of the biggest mounds, there would have been a lot more around it. But yeah, those are good questions. What was I saying? Oh yeah, slides. Some of my interns don't know what a slide is anymore because they've never seen negatives, they've never seen slides, but we curate everything. So the idea is to curate as much context with the artifacts as possible. So that's always really important for us. So again, our storerooms kind of look like this. Our facility, the research facility, was completed in 2008. We had a huge grant from Save America's Treasures. Legislature then matched that. So the facility was completed in 2008. It is purpose-built, which means it is built for archaeological collection storage. Again, we're the only repository in West Virginia for long-term storage of archaeological materials, and we are a state repository, and we're also a federal repository. So we also curate collections from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Army Corps of Engineers. So what we have in our collections looks very much like this. So we have collections that were excavated by our state archaeologists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when we had a state archaeologist. West Virginia actually does not anymore. So we have a lot of these collections that we call like legacy collections that are from when we had a state archaeologist. We had a huge research archaeological program in the state. We have CRM collections as well, contract archaeology collections. Those usually come in looking pretty nice. And we also accept private donations from private collectors. And so these private collections and these legacy collections all need a lot of processing. They come in, you know, looking like this. There's just kind of old bags. There's a lot of mouse chewing here. There's a little mouse nest here. He's just kind of hanging out. It's very nice. It's very cozy, I'm sure. Having a great time. So it really takes a lot of work to unpack all of these, to wash the artifacts, catalog everything. Some of them are you know, in small boxes. But we do that. It's very painstaking, but it's very important to keep all those collections in a way that is not damaging the collections, but also in a way that is accessible for other researchers. If somebody wants to come in and says, I want everything from Ohio County or everything from Mason County, I want all archaic or late prehistoric, then we need to be able to pool those collections and have them in a state where a researcher can look at them. And how we process archaeological collections, which is very similar to what Dr. Nass does here with the collections in the lab, is we evaluate a collection, we wash a collection, we label it, we identify it, we catalog it, we put it into our database, and we bag and box it. We put them in archival materials, we put them in archival boxes. Everything is labeled to the kind of highest archival conservation standards. But that process takes a very long time for every single artifact, every single collection. So most of the time our interns and our curatorial assistants are washing artifacts. It's very therapeutic. If you're ever on something that's, you know, very relaxing, you can kind of listen to music or like listen to a podcast. It's very nice to just sit and watch artifacts, actually. And the reason that we do that is, again, so that the data can be collected for cataloging, we can put that into our database, but also, again, to make it accessible. If a researcher comes in and wants to look at, you know, said artifacts, the point is that they're already cleaned. Nobody wants to come in and do their own kind of dirty work, literally. So again, we do a lot of washing of artifacts, a lot of processing, and we have collections for decades. Solid job security. We identify by material type. This is also just pretty standard in archaeology. We separate from ceramics, prehistoric versus historic ceramics. We separate bone, faunal material, shell, lithic, metal, botanical, and the best category, which is question mark, which is the one you're not really sure what it is. But some of the projects that we've been working on in the lab are Blennerhassett Mansion. Has anyone been down to that? It's near Parkersburg. Yeah, it's a really nice site. It's on an island in the Ohio River. It's really fascinating. And the mansion actually was built, 1799, actually burned to the ground about 12 years later, so it wasn't actually there for very long. But the Blennerhassetts were a very rich Irish family, I believe. Came over, built this house when, 1799, the Ohio River was still absolutely the frontier. So they were really just on the western kind of border. And they built this, huge kind of mansion. And Harmon, although Harmon wasn't really the best businessman, he went bankrupt a couple times. So it wasn't super successful, but he was also part of the Burr conspiracy. Aaron Burr, the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton, it's really stretching my U.S. history. But he was in cahoots with Aaron Burr, actually. So Burr was actually on the island and in the mansion at one point. But Harmon used to throw these huge, lavish parties. So again, it burned down around 1811. And West Virginia DNR actually reconstructed it. So in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, they did a lot of archaeological investigation to find the footprint of Blennerhassett Mansion so that they could reconstruct it. So DNR reconstructed it in late 80s, I believe, and now it's open as a tourist site. It is really, it's a very cool tourist site. It's stunning. You take a little ferry across the river. You can walk around the island. You take a horse-drawn carriage. That's very, very cute. But again, so there's a huge historic site, which is the mansion, but there are also about a dozen prehistoric sites on the island. So the island was absolutely occupied from the archaic period all the way up to contact period. So we can look at really kind of an interesting utilization of, an island in the Ohio River by historic peoples, but also by, prehistoric indigenous peoples. And our archaeology month poster for West Virginia for this year will be on Ohio River Islands. So it's really fascinating. But I also have a student doing research on the historic component. He's actually trying to do archival research and find the names of the enslaved individuals who were on Blennerhassett. So there was a historian at Blennerhassett Museum who wrote a really nice history of the Blennerhassetts, Harmon and Margaret, but not anybody else. So we really don't know much about anything else that happened on the island unless it dealt with the actual landowners. So there's a lot of stories that haven't really been told. So we're kind of going through that archaeological collection and seeing what else, what other questions we can kind of think of. So that's one of the sites that we're working on. Another one is the Roseberry Farm site, which is in Mason County. So more southern West Virginia, so this is still Ohio River. Down near where Point Pleasant is, if you guys have ever been to Point Pleasant, of Mothman fame. So right at a really nice area right on the Ohio River is the Roseberry site. There was a middle woodland mound and a late prehistoric village site. And again, at the confluence of two rivers and a creek, so it's probably very fertile land, a lot of really nice areas to fish, a lot of areas to hunt. So a lot of the material we're getting from this prehistoric site, we have a lot of faunal material. This is a bobcat tooth. These are a lot of bone tools. This is a hoe made with a shell. This is something that stumped me for weeks, actually. I don't know if anyone knows what it is. It's a corn kernel. So apparently when corn carbonizes, which is why it's black, and kind of thrown into a fire, the middle, the germ part, immediately kind of fizzles and evaporates, but then the top part of the corn kernel carbonizes. So that took me quite a while. Actually, I think it was Dr. Nass who had a jar of them, and that's when I recognized him. I didn't know what it was before then.
There's actually some in the cabinet right there across from you.
Oh, really? I had never seen them until I think Dr. Nass had them when I was here for the field school. And it was like a light bulb moment. This is a deer elbow, which is polished into an awl, so something for poking holes in leather. And this is a fish jaw from suckerfish, actually, or I think a red horse fish. So we get a lot of faunal material, a lot of fish, a lot of animal bones from this site. So it was excavated in the 1970s. None of this material was washed, by the way. My students and I are washing it right now. So it was still in the original bags. So we're still processing it and still finding some really, really cool stuff. And the one site that's really, really been exciting, which you can also visit actually, is near Clarksburg. It's called Oak Mounds, so Harrison County. Again, an Adena burial mound, not quite as large as Grave Creek. It was excavated completely by Salem College. It was a history professor in 1969. The other mound that was adjacent to was most likely destroyed earlier in the century. It was excavated, unfortunately, with heavy machinery in 1969. They destroyed most of the burial tombs, actually. And it was never inventoried. It was never published. So we had the collection, and my student and I actually just submitted a publication for the West Virginia archaeologists based on the collection. So it was something that, again, a lot of these sites are sitting in repositories, or sitting in museums just waiting for someone to research them. So I had a student who was from Clarksburg, from Harrison County, and she was really interested in the site. So she really kind of ran with it. So again, we just submitted it, and a lot of our analysis was actually based on the original archival notes, which was amazing to have. But they're very, very scant, so we couldn't even actually reconstruct where each of the burials were. This is a really tiny note, written in cursive, which also a lot of college students don't know how to read now, so that's becoming a little bit difficult. I will say, if you want to do history, you have to learn how to read cursive. So the only way we could actually figure out where the one cremation burial was is from this tiny little note that we found slipped into another piece of like folder in with the other stuff. So what we just submitted for publication is a complete inventory of the collection, a little more of an analysis, but also my student went back and actually found some people who were on the 1969 excavation, and she interviewed them. So they actually remembered things, they actually had photos that we didn't have. So that was amazing. Yeah, right.
Now, is there a hypothesis, because you have the Grave Creek Mound being this massive, and then you're talking about Oak Mound being smaller.
Yep.
Is there a significance, has there been other mounds found that aren't as big
There
as?
are, I mean, a mound from anywhere from 6 inches tall to 70 feet high. So
Is there some indication of what class structure within this and more
I
prominence?
think a lot of people have equated it to class structure, whether or not there is also a lot of other factors at play, seasonality, when they're building things. Also different preferences, whether individual preferences.
Okay.
It's always, I mean, I think in archaeology status is always the kind of excuse, but I think there's a lot of more nuance to it. Also, I mean, we do see the burial practices really changing through time. I mean, at kind of the end of the Adena, you start the middle woodland stone mounds, and those are completely different. They're mounds, but they're built and constructed very differently.
Okay.
So whether or not it's just kind of some change through time, that's a good question that I don't exactly know the answer.
Right.
But there's just, I mean, a lot of variability. Like when you walk into a cemetery today, there's still a lot of variability. So it could indicate a myriad of things.
All right.
But that's a tough question. It's a good question. Someone should write a couple books on it. What we've been able to do, again, reconstruct the oral history of the excavation of the mound, which has been really fun. Actually talk to the people who were on the excavation in 1969. We could review the skeletal data, actually update the skeletal data. That's going to be put on the NAG for inventory. Rehouse everything, so everything's now in archival containers. And because my student actually started talking to the original landowner, and the landowner of this mound, it had been in the family since the 1700s. It was still in the same family, actually. The family just recently donated the small plot of land that the mound is on to the Archaeological Conservancy. So that's basically the best case scenario you could think of at the end of something, is the land actually gets preserved in perpetuity, which means no one else will go back to it, no one will excavate it, no one will develop it, no one's going to put a gas station on it. It's basically kind of preserved forever, which is really nice. The other thing that we do at Grave Creek, which is not my specialty, but we have an education coordinator, and she organizes a lot of annual events. Typically we have a fossil day. We just had one March 2nd, I believe, which is really fun. We bring in the state geologists, and anybody who has a rock can bring it in, and the state geologist will actually identify it. It's very cute. You have all these kids with bags of rocks, and I mean, they have such a good time. Also adults with bags of rocks. It's a really fun day. So we usually have a fossil day in March and another one in September, I believe. Our archaeology day is always the first weekend in October. Monthly lectures start up next month, I believe. I think we're having Dave Schofield from Meadowcroft. He's the education guy at Meadowcroft. He'll be there. And June 22nd, we have a really nice Adena dance group who has been there a couple times now. And we're bringing in a native food truck from Columbus, Ohio. So that'll be really fun. Yeah, that'll be a really fun event, actually. I think I might be out of town, but I'm sure it'll be great. But our Facebook and Instagram pages always have the most up-to-date event stuff. And we usually do an artifact of the week. Maybe not always every week. But we'll pull something from the collections and do research on it and put it on social media as well. So I think that's my last slide. Yes. Anybody have any other fun questions?
Yeah, you said it was between 250 and 500 years that mound was developed. But yet when they excavated it, they only found 2 chambers.
Yes.
What would be the impetus to continue to develop something if you've only got 2 people buried here?
That's a great question. What else would you use something just to make it big? Just to make it monumental. Just to make it as big as amazing as possible. Why does anybody make anything big?
My mound's bigger than your mound.
Yeah, look how big this one is. Or maybe the people in it were really important. There's some really interesting questions that are really tough to answer. But burial sites are always fascinating.
So you excavate all these little things, clean them up, and you put them in a box,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. And then
Well-
they sit there forever unless somebody's gonna research it.
Yes. So the point of kind of collection storage is that it's available for research. Yeah. So we don't want to necessarily see them, in someone's attic where they can't be accessible for research. So that's why we have a lab. That's why we have space for researchers, basically. But yeah, that's part of our mission, is to make it accessible. But we don't dig anymore, sadly. Yeah.
The mound in Ohio that you said is similar to this.
Miamisburg, yeah.
Is it, where they buried?
Yes, it's a burial mound as well. It's a similar burial mound.
Okay.
Yeah.
And about the same age?
Yeah, it's also Adena, so like early woodland. Yeah. Yeah, there were thousands of mounds, actually. There was a Smithsonian report in the 1880s, I believe, that recorded them all along the Ohio River and Kanawha River and into Ohio, and there were thousands of mounds. Most of them were plowed over to, cultivate fields by colonists. They didn't know or they didn't care, so most of them are lost. The ones that you see now are just the few that are still, they were either too big to move, like Grave Creek,
Yeah.
it's too big, or it's a fluke of preservation, somebody wanted to save it. All the other ones have been destroyed.
So you don't actually know, like, how many people
Nope.
might be in there, like, there could just
Nope.
be the,
There could have only been the two. However, it would be pretty uncommon. I will say other mounds of comparable size have 30 or 40 people. They might be buried, kind of around the edges. We're not sure, but other ones have more people. But although, Grave Creek could be unique. It is huge.
So they bury people and then they cover them over and then they
Mhm.
bury some more people
Yep.
and they make it bigger. It didn't start out being that big. They just,
No, probably not. It probably was built, what we would say like successively. We're not sure how many phases. Was it just 2 for each burial? Was it, multiple phases? We're not sure. Some of the other ones look like they were, used for hundreds of years.
Has the soil been analyzed for human remains?
What's that?
Has the soil from the mound ever been analyzed for human remains?
The soil that we have from the coring has not.
Okay?
We have it stored safely, but we haven't looked through it for human remains.
Because logically, the Indians had a habit of burning their bodies.
Not all the burials in the mounds are cremations.
Right. But
Some
you
of them
would-
are.
You would take your cremations down, and that would be like taking your family to the cemetery.
Yeah, that's possible. In a lot of the Adena mounds, we have inhumations, which are buried bodies, and we also have cremations. So there's definitely some variation in body treatment.
what do you suppose would happen if they took the dapper dogs?
They probably smell something.
You think they would find?
They
Or
would,
swats.
but they're in there, so we don't actually need the dogs.
No, but it'd be nice to
pretty
know
sure.
where they are. How many are kind of in there?
Maybe, but we'll never put a shovel in it, so
No,
it
no.
doesn't matter.
No.
So you can still walk on it at the moment, but we cannot. We can't really repair the steps because if you pulled the steps out, you would be disturbing it. So we kind of just patch them and kind of make them slightly safe, but it's kind of a climb at your own risk situation.
When did the steps, when were they put in?
That's a great question. We think they were put in around the late 30s. There's also a little, you can barely see it, but there's a little tiny obelisk on top that someone put there. I think it's 1941 is the date on it. It was probably done by the prisoners at the penitentiary because they were still being still under the warden's care then. And the obelisk just has the cardinal directions on it. Which is kind of interesting. If you're standing up, you can actually see, which is south, which is north, Ohio is west. It's a very impressive view of the valley. my window. Everyone can see into my office.